Hello, Maryland's 8th Congressional District and beyond, to all my wonderful constituents. I'm very excited today to have as my special guest a very dear, beloved friend of mine, State Senator Will Smith, who took the District 20 State Senate seat after I was there. He's my successor, and we have been very close friends for a long time, and sometimes he describes me as his mentor, which means I guess he's my protege. But Will, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm so proud of everything you've done in just a few short years. Will has risen to become the chairman of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, which is something that I was never able to accomplish when I was in Annapolis for 10 years. And so he's the chair of the State Senate's Judiciary Committee, overseeing the courts and criminal justice and civil justice and constitutional law. So congratulations on doing that, and congratulations on unveiling a great package for state criminal justice reform. And that's what we're having you on to talk about today. So we can talk about both what's happening on the federal side and on the state side. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Congressman, or Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here. And although you didn't become chairman, you became our distinguished congressman from District 8 and a renowned constitutional law scholar that we all continue to learn from, not only on the international stage and the national stage, but here in Maryland. So glad to be following in your footsteps just for a little bit, at least. So.
Well, Will, I could not be prouder of everything you've been doing. And of course, I have to salute you also for your service to the country with your recent engagement over in Afghanistan as a naval intelligence officer. We missed you very much, and the prayers and the thoughts and love of our district were completely with you. And so we're glad that you're back safe and sound, that you've become chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee at this critical time when we really need to take so many of the great proposals that have been out there that have not been acted on and put them into motion and come up with other ideas. I wanted to start by just telling you, because I know you weren't able to see it, but we had a hearing yesterday in the House Judiciary Committee, and George Floyd's brother appeared. And it was wrenching, searing to hear his testimony, basically asking the Congress in America to make the pain stop and to deal with the agony that so many families have gone through with this just unceasing wave of police killings across the country. And so we're hoping that this will be a turning point for America, and that we will be able to change direction. And Mr. Floyd's testimony was riveting, and I recommend that everybody go watch it. We also had a number of our friends and great lawyers come and testify, including Sherilyn Eiffel, who was there from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Vanita Gupta, who was there on behalf of the Leadership Conference, and I think the Lawyers Committee, and of course, Paul Butler, who actually I spoke to last week, along with Angela Davis, and Paul, who's a professor at Georgetown now, and author of a new book called Chokehold, Policing the Black Man. He testified about the history of official violence and racist police brutality. All of it was in service of our new legislation we've introduced called the Justice in Policing Act of 2020. And Will, I'm proud of how quickly we came together on this as a caucus. We now have, we almost have a majority of the Congress. I think we have 210, 211 co-sponsors. We need 218 to pass it. I'm convinced we're going to get there. And based on what happened yesterday, we might have Republicans coming over. Our legislation bans chokeholds and strangleholds completely. Any police tactic that's based on asphyxiation is banned, forbidden across the country. We banned racial, ethnic, and religious profiling in our legislation too. We, in our legislation, have created a nationwide database for police misconduct. So if someone is fired or dismissed or forced to resign in Georgia because of police brutality, they can't resurface 3 months later as a new police officer in Houston, Texas. So we're going to be able to keep track of that. We ban the sale of military equipment and weaponry from the Department of Defense to local governments. So we're stopping the transfer of weapons into local police departments and halting, we hope, the militarization of police. So much of what was discussed yesterday was the importance of shifting from a warrior mentality in the police forces to a guardian mentality, that officers are here to protect the community, not to police the community and to be at war with the community. We're also taking care of a number of legal doctrines that have become very problematic. The qualified immunity, which has become an escape hatch for a lot of cops who've committed violence illegitimately against civilians. And if they essentially can prove that the exact fact pattern of their violence had not taken before, then they can claim that they were somehow unaware that this was unconstitutional. So we're going to get rid of that booby trap. But more importantly, I'm hoping that we can push further to establish respondeat superior, which just means the master answers for the employees. Right now, if George Floyd had lived or his family, they can't sue the police department because they're not responsible for the officers unless you can show that that was an official policy. So that's as important, if not more important, than I think getting rid of qualified immunity, which is suing a police officer individually in civil tort. So these are some of the key features, in addition to training and also establishing a nationwide rule. If you want federal money, you've got to accept our rule that you can't use lethal force except to save life. In other words, you don't take a life unless you absolutely have to in order to save a life. But otherwise, why do you have your knee on somebody's neck? It doesn't make any sense. So that's where we're going. The Republicans were surprisingly mild about it. They tried to pick a fight about some of the activist calls for defunding the police, which is not part of this package. It's not a funding bill. It's not an appropriations bill. It's about changing the law. But a lot of them spoke pretty sympathetically to what we're trying to do, which is good, because this should be bipartisan. And I finished up by saying, look, there have been two other moments like this in American history. One, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, it lasted for 12 years, where there was a real transfer of resources and land and political power and voting rights to African-American freed slaves. And we made real progress interracially as a country then. And then it all got turned back by the Supreme Court and racism. And the same thing happened a century later with the Civil Rights Movement. We got the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And it took the blood sacrifice of Dr. King and Schwerner, Cheney, Goodman, and everybody in SNCC who fought in Mississippi and Alabama. And then that got turned back by the Berger Court and the Rehnquist Court and the Roberts Court and Nixon and Reagan and Trump and so on. But now the country, because of the young people who have come out in force across America and Black Lives Matter, they've given us a chance. They've given us an opportunity to make good on the promise of America, of equal rights, equal justice for everybody. So that's what we're trying to do at the federal level, but so much more of this is going to take place at the state and local level, which is why we come to you, the chairman of the Maryland Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee.
Well, thanks, Congressman, and thanks, Jamie. I mean, it's exciting to hear about the reforms going on in Congress, and I've said in my letter, an open letter to our constituents and to my colleagues in the Maryland General Assembly, that it's just tragic that it takes the death and the loss of another precious Black soul to kind of garner this national movement, an international movement, to give us the political will to do what we know we should have done before. And a lot of these injustices are ingrained in almost every permutation of society that dates back to our original sin. And you're right with respect to the generational changes with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and then the Civil Rights Act. I was talking to my mother about how this feels awful like the 60s, and she said, yeah, 1968 in particular, after Dr. King was murdered. I mean, she's a resident and a native of Washington, D.C., so she had firsthand experience with this. And one thing that I said was, I think, a distinction is that the coalition of folks out in the streets and asking for real change is more diverse in terms of generation and ethnicity than ever before. And that's really encouraging. And so it's really encouraging to see what you all are doing on the federal level. We were talking a little bit about this the other day with respect to kind of some of the liability caps or insurance in terms of how to incentivize behavior for the locals. And it's interesting because what you're doing with qualified immunity is actually very important, and the responding superior as well. But with qualified immunity, when you think of a deprivation of civil rights in police brutality, you think of those 1983 claims, and obviously that's a federal thing. There are no caps on those claims. And so that's good, but obviously qualified immunity has gotten in the way, and the way that the court has interpreted it, qualified immunity over the last term or two has been obviously not plaintiff friendly. And so, and I think just 2 months ago, they refused to grant cert on the latest case that would have dealt with that. So I know that the movement's been afoot in Congress, and Senator Booker to the stuff that you guys are talking about now have been looking to change and kind of redefine what Section 1983 is, so that the court's interpretation will then, obviously change. So that's obviously very, very important work. But on the state level, I put forth a package of reforms that have been before the legislature before. Advocates like Senator Jill Carter, Senator Charles Sidnor from Baltimore County, Delegate Alonzo Washington, Delegate Eric Barron from Prince George's County. These folks have been working on these issues for years, but we just never had the political will to get them done. And so it was my hope to seize this moment and to capture this energy to put this at the top of the agenda. And the Speaker of the House, Adrienne Jones, our first African-American speaker, she formed a task force to deal with this, and the Senate President, being from Baltimore City, has made this a top priority as well. So part of that package is disciplinary records, making sure that those are open and accessible to the public, to the MPIA, the Maryland Public Information Act. That's something that is nested within the LEOBR, which is a collectively bargained for agreement. And that's really where the real tension point for a lot of the reforms has been in the state, because our friends in labor protect the whole concept and the process of collective bargaining. And I think Benjamin Sachs has been doing some great work. He's a Harvard law professor. And he lays out the framework of just how obviously the labor movement has been critical in making sure that we have fair working standards, increased wages, access to materials that you need to accomplish your job, for schools, for sanitation workers, for making sure that we have equity in our workplace. And so when our brothers and sisters in labor collectively bargain to shield information and to facilitate or to block access to justice, that's something that we have the moral responsibility to have that conversation, and that's been difficult. We haven't had the political will to do it.
That's an awesome point. Just to pick up on that for one second. I mean, I think that that our law enforcement officers, the vast majority of whom are law-abiding, decent, good, public-spirited servants, they have a right to bargain for wages and benefits and hours and all that stuff. But when we're talking about, well, should they be able to bargain not to be investigated themselves by the police in the event of a civilian death for a cooling off period, 30 days or 60 days or something? I mean, who bargains for that in any other labor contract?
That's exactly right.
And there's a public interest there. That's not just about the terms of employment.
That's exactly right. And so, I mean, piggybacking off the investigation, right now under the LEOBR, you can only be investigated, an officer can only be investigated by a sworn law enforcement officer, or if the governor intervenes, the attorney general or the attorney general's designee. So there's no real independence there. So we want to have a state prosecutor, or give the chiefs the ability to have a special prosecutor or the state prosecutor come in, give them subpoena power, so you can have a real independent investigation. That's part of the reform package. But also you talked about demilitarization of the police. That's so important. The 1033 program, which is obviously a federal program, allows local jurisdictions to get military-grade equipment for essentially pennies on the dollar. I want to prevent that from happening for our local municipalities and for our state. And so that's something that someone in the military equipment, it tends to escalate the situation. And the way that you're postured tends to escalate the situation. You don't want those things on our streets when you're supposed to have a community aspect of policing. So that's something that I'm glad that the Congress is dealing with as well. that dovetails with that is the implicit bias training that we're going to make sure that the Police Training and Standards Commission sets the floor for that. A lot of local jurisdictions have been doing some innovative things, but we don't have enough of it. When you, again, back to the military analogy, when you deploy downrange, you get cultural competency training. You're inundated with the cultural customs and the norms. How do you stand with your weapon? What image you're projecting when you're interfacing with local populations. The same is true with community policing. You have to understand the history. You have to understand that you have implicit bias. And so officers need to be trained in those measures as well. So we could go on. Excessive force bystander intervention is something that's going to be critical. You saw that in the George Floyd. 3 other officers just stood by while one officer had his knee on his neck for close to 8 minutes. That's something that we want to implement in training in Maryland as well. So lots of reforms that I think we have political will for now on the state level.
Yeah, that's just fantastic. Well, one thing I should tell you about, because I know we've worked on it together when we served together in Annapolis, was about civil asset forfeiture. Yeah. And we reformed that. We did get that done in Maryland. It used to be that the police essentially could just take your property, whether it's your car, $80, your condo, if they had suspicion that it was involved in either the proceeds of crime or an instrumentality of crime. And it was overwhelmingly targeted at minority communities. There was one case that just broke my heart of a young African-American man in Baltimore who was going to school in West Virginia, and he was driving back and he got stopped by police in Maryland who thought that he was involved in drugs, which he wasn't, but they did a search of the car and they found that in the car there was trace amounts of marijuana in the back, which apparently like 60% of cars have, and he had bought the car used or something. They confiscated the car, so he couldn't get to school. He forfeited all of the money he'd spent for tuition. He wasn't able to get to his job. I mean, just this cascading series of consequences. Luckily, he ended up finding the ACLU and they were able to get him paid back. But think about all the people that's happening to. So anyway, the law was that if the government took your property in Maryland, you had to go and prove that your property was innocent. I mean, total reversal of due process. So we did get that changed, but still that's the law around the country in most places. So I'm going to try to get that made part of our justice and policing package to get rid of the civil asset forfeiture laws, which are allowing real abuse of people's rights and a total distortion of due process. But do you feel like it's a moment of opportunity in the state legislature, the way we're feeling it in Congress, because the young people in the streets and Black Lives Matter have completely changed the political equation, and the public opinion polls are showing 3/4 of Americans are supporting the protests?
No, absolutely. I mean, and that's kind of the point of the letter that I wrote to my colleagues and the constituents, is to basically to take advantage of this moment in time and to harness it into real change. I mean, I said it's unfortunate that it takes a tragedy of this magnitude to kickstart this process, not only in the legislatures, but in City Hall and the county council and then in Congress. And so here in Maryland, we have a new Senate president, we have a new Speaker of the House, and we have new chairs of the judicial committees. And so that's something that we haven't seen in 40 years, frankly. And I definitely feel the difference in Annapolis, and I'm very hopeful that we'll have real change aimed at the systems, not at the officers. Like you said before, this is about addressing inadequate and unjust systems. And so it's about a structural change that I think we have an opportunity to seize this moment and make real change.
Let's close on that thought, Will, because another part of our very big bill, which has got magnificent stuff in it, and I recommend everybody go check out the Justice and Policing Act, but another part of it is to make it a federal crime to conspire to lynch. We have never succeeded in the entire history of the United States, succeeded in making lynching into a federal crime, a federal felony. It's always died in the Senate. And so we're bringing it back again, saying now is the time to do it. And, what we saw in Minneapolis was a lynching of a man. It was a modern day lynching, in addition to being deliberate murder. It was intentional murder. Reflect a bit on the history of it, because you often talk about your family and what your family has been through over the generations. And what is it like as a young man, and I still consider you a young man, you're in your 30s. I mean, what is it like being poised at this moment to be part of some really momentous, sweeping changes that a lot of people's families have been waiting for generations?
I think it's right. And the reality is that I guess the proliferation of social media and cell phone cameras has shown cast a spotlight on a lot of the activity and abuses and the actual carnage that's been going on in communities of color for generations. And those incidents have caused conversations within Black families for generations. I remember growing up and my parents talking about their experience growing up in segregated city and their experiences coming through and being young adults at the height of the civil rights movement. And so this moment in time is basically thrust what a lot of folks have been feeling for generations to the forefront and the top of everyone's mind. And so to be here in this moment and the product of family members and parents that have struggled to give me every opportunity in the world to put myself in this position and to be here and to be part of this conversation, I think it's incumbent upon all of us in elected office to think and reflect about what we can do and what we should be doing in the future to make sure that we're addressing some of these systemic injustices. This is truly a historic moment, and it's something that we have to seize upon to make sure that we have the broad systemic change. So this is our challenge, and I hope we meet it.
Well, historians are going to spend a long time figuring out exactly the dynamics of COVID-19 and everybody stuck at home and then everybody watching the video and then everybody coming out of their homes to protest and to object, and the young people leading us and Black Lives Matter being in the forefront. It's a remarkable time that we're in. It's a time of great danger for democracy and for people, and great hope and opportunity and promise. And Will, I got to say, my friend, that you embody so much of the hope and the promise for the future. And I could not be more thrilled about where you are as the chairman of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, as Maryland prepares to undertake exactly the task that we're engaged in Congress. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Congressman. I was going to say thank you for always educating us, for always teaching us to love, and for always leading us and making sure that we're always on the right side of history. So, and for inspiring a whole generation of leaders that are coming up in Annapolis and learning from you every day. So thank you for everything you're doing, and whatever we can do to support you, let us know.
Stay healthy and stay close, my friend.
Likewise.
And love to the whole family.
Likewise.